Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar hosted by the National Capital Finance Alliance on our project AERM, which stands for Advancing Environmental Risk Management. So on this webinar, we are going to go through a short introduction by myself to the NCFA and some of the projects that we have been developing. This will be a little introduction to the relevance of natural capital to financial institutions and specifically to UniCredit by Giorgio Capuri, Group Sustainability Manager at UniCredit. This will be followed by a overview of phase 1 of AERM by Katie Leach at UNEP-WCMC. And finally, we will have an overview of phase 2 of AERM by Will Everson from PwC. And hopefully, if everybody is managing to be efficient in their presentations, we will be also able to have a little bit of a Q&A at the end of it. Now, a little bit of housekeeping. If you do have any questions or any challenges with hearing or something like that, any technical issues, please type them into the question box that you have or into the chat window, and we will be able to address those issues. Like I said, if you have any questions, please send them through the chat window, and we will address those at the appropriate time. So a little bit of first who we are and what we do. So the National Capital Finance Alliance itself is a joint initiative of UN Environment Finance Initiative and Global Canopy. So we were set up in 2012, and we've been working essentially as an alliance of financial institutions, supporters, and other stakeholders that work towards bridging natural capital issues and the finance sector across investments, banking, and insurance. Some of the previous things that we have been working on include water scarcity modeling, drought stress testing, and deforestation risk. If you're interested in some of the work that we've been doing so far, please do visit our website, naturalcapitalfinancealliance.org. The AERM project has been growing out of our previous work on trying to look at specific instances of natural capital risk, such as deforestation, water, and drought issues. But this is our flagship project because it goes much broader, it's much more comprehensive, and it's much more detailed in how it approaches environmental risk. When we talk about environmental risk, we talk about the inputs from nature that businesses depend upon. So a lot of environmental risk management today done by financial institutions is done incredibly well, but it largely focuses on the impact that businesses have on the environment. So we complement that work by looking at how businesses depend on the environment and the risks that this may cause. Now, how generally would we be able to assess exposure to natural capital related risk? We would need to know how businesses depend on the environment, on nature or natural capital inputs. We would need to know what causes risks to these dependencies, because even though there are dependencies there, not all these dependencies constitute risk. We would also need to know what can be measured in order to assess the risk to businesses and to the financial institutions. So what do we provide through this project? We provide a database of dependency by sector, natural capital dependency by business sector. We link these dependencies to ecosystem assets, to essentially nature and the drivers of change in those assets. And we have a list of available data that is relevant for risk analysis, both globally and in certain priority countries that we work in. How do we apply this to financial institutions? Well, we provide first a what we're calling a rapid natural capital risk appraisal. Essentially, it's a broad assessment to identify hotspots of natural capital related risk exposure based, for example, on business sectors, on geographies, or specific activities within each of the institutions. Now, initially, this will focus on banks, and really the project launch at the end of the year will feature a rapid natural capital risk appraisal methodology for banks specifically. But we are expecting also to widen this into investment and insurance sectors in the coming years. The second thing that we are looking at specifically in this cycle of the project is also a number of pilot studies looking at measuring natural capital risk and integrating it into risk management processes. So focusing on one specific risk type, sector, or geography to explore risk quantification and integration into risk processes. But before we come to the specifics of this project, I'm going to hand over to Giorgio Capuri, who's from UniCredit. UniCredit is one of our long-standing members and a very, very good supporter of our natural capital work, and we're delighted to have Giorgio talk on this webinar. So over to you, Giorgio.
Thank you very much, Anders. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear me well, because during the test, apparently, I was not very clear. Anyway, I work at UniCredit, which is an Italian bank. If you can move to next slide, please. UniCredit is a pan-European bank. We are based in Western and Eastern Europe, mainly Italy, Austria, Germany, and Central Eastern Europe. We basically work on the commercial banking space, and our corporate investment banking division is meant to support our corporate business, mainly across the regions where we have a presence. Next, please. Okay, so here you can have a picture that shows where we are present across Europe, including the partnership with UniCredit, which is a 50-50%. Next, please. Now, let me tell you something about what is our environmental management background. Our main focus is investing in renewable energy sources and carbon trading. We have run a carbon trading business for more than 10 years now, and we started with pilot phase in the ETS market, and we have now 8 billion portfolio in terms of outstanding exposure default, and mainly photovoltaic plus wind, which is minor part, and other sources. We are also active in the energy efficiency market with a number of activities that we run in several areas, and also we are leading the Italian part of the EMAP, the Energy Efficiency Mortgage Action Plan, which is sponsored by a number of players, among which valuers, construction, building, enterprises, etc. We are also extremely active on the green bond side. UniCredit was, together with other partners, among the first banks leading a green bond to the market with the climate awareness bond in 2007. And we are a member of Green Bond Principle and Social Bond Principle and the Climate Bond Initiative. Finally, we have put a specific focus since at least 10 years on a number of projects aiming at providing our bank with an understanding of risk of the type that Anders has introduced so far, in which AERM project is the flagship project, because Natural Capital Finance Alliance is working on many other projects on the same line. We are a member of the Investing Initiative, which is a French investing fund that many of you might know, and they are focusing on aligning the portfolio of financial institutions to a two-degree scenario. We are a member of the Natural Capital Finance Alliance, and we are one of the signatories to the Natural Capital Declaration since its inception at Rio +20 in 2012. And as Anders explained so far, we are an active member of the UNEP Finance Initiative since many years.
AERM has two phases. Phase one is very much collecting the knowledge base, all of the data and understanding of nature that we need in order to proceed to the risk process, risk assessment. This collection of the link between nature and potential risk exposure has been done by UNEP-WCMC, which is United Nations Environment World Conservation Monitoring Center, and the leader of that project has been Katie Leach. So we're very excited to have Katie here walk us through some of the work that they've been doing and some of the experiences that we already have now from phase one. So over to you, Katie.
Great, thanks very much, Anders, and hello everyone. So yeah, as Anders said, UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre has been working with the Natural Capital Finance Alliance over about the past year and a half on this advancing environmental risk management project. And broadly, we've been trying to understand how businesses depend on nature and what the potential risk exposure could be for financial institutions. Next slide, please. So the first phase of the project is really about building this knowledge base that's needed for financial institutions to understand potential exposure to natural capital risks. But before we launch into kind of exploring this knowledge base in a bit more detail, I really wanted to just take a step back and think about how we define natural capital and how it's important for financial institutions. So as defined by the Natural Capital Finance Alliance, the natural capital is the stock of renewable natural resources that combine to yield a flow of benefits to people. And the diagram by the Natural Capital Coalition here explains how this works well. So natural capital is really the stock of these natural resources at the start here, underpinned by biodiversity as the variety of all plant and animal life on Earth. And those natural capital stocks combine to create a flow, and this flow is often referred to as ecosystem services, so the benefits that people receive from different ecosystems. And with those, we're able to achieve value and benefits to business and society. So as just a really quick example at this point, forests as a natural capital stock provide a number of different ecosystem services, but one of these is water filtration. And in fact, one tree can filter more than 36,000 gallons of water a year. So they're really important for natural water filtration. And the value that businesses and society derive from this is clean drinking water, both for staff and for production processes. Next slide. So that said, natural capital underpins all economic activities, and companies in which financial institutions have an interest, whether that's through investment, lending, or perhaps insurance. But all companies are reliant on natural capital for a range of functions. That might be for raw materials like water or different fibers or other materials, or it might be for more regulating type ecosystem services like climate regulation or flood protection. But for example, so a bank may make a loan to an agricultural business that's dependent on ecosystem services such as pollination or pest control. if the business doesn't sustainably manage those ecosystem services or the natural capital that provides them, like habitats or species, then it could lead to a reduction in biodiversity on the land and reduce yields. And this thereby harms the ability of that agricultural business to service its debt to the bank. And while some banks are already conducting environmental impact assessments before they make a loan, the scope of those assessments is often limited to direct impacts, and it doesn't tend to take into account how those businesses rely on natural capital. So applying this type of approach that we'll talk about here through the natural capital knowledge base can really enhance a financial institution's ability to manage risks. Next slide. But there's also many benefits in maintaining natural capital. So I've just picked out an example here from the finance sector, and it just shows that, well, it doesn't show here, but in the past 10 years, insurers have paid out globally more than $200 billion for coastal damages from storms. But there are aspects of natural capital like habitats, and in particular coastal wetlands, that can act as natural defences to protect coastlines by slowing waves and also reducing flooding. And this one example here by Lloyd's and the Nature Conservancy, amongst others, shows how coastal wetlands prevented around $625 million worth of damages to properties during Hurricane Sandy. But these coastal wetlands not only help during extreme weather events, they also can help on an annual basis, reducing storm damages by over 20% in New Jersey alone. Next slide. But it's not only important to understand where the existing natural capital is, for example, those coastal wetlands, but it's also important to understand what could be driving degradation or depletion of that natural capital. So things like overfishing, increased use of pesticides, and increased occurrence of fires and deforestation or drought events can put at risk the capacity of those natural capital assets to provide ecosystem services that the businesses depend on. So this brings us to the natural capital knowledge base. Yes, next slide, please. So the first part of the natural capital knowledge base is really for us to look at in what ways the businesses depend on nature. The second part of that is to look at what is the likelihood that the ecosystem services are disrupted. And then the final part of the natural capital knowledge base as part of phase one is what data can be used to assess the risk of disruption. So I'm just going to talk through all of these individually and just give a bit more detail on those. So in terms of looking at how businesses depend on nature, we've catalogued those different business dependencies on ecosystem services. So taking the 29 ecosystem services, so things like climate regulation, water or fibre provision. And we've looked at how a number of sub-industries, but looking more specifically at production processes, and how those production processes, like natural fibre production, depend on different ecosystem services. And when we summarise those results, we found that, next slide please, Anders. We found that the industries that tend to have the highest number of dependencies on different aspects of natural capital are industries like agriculture, forest products and construction. And the ecosystem services that tend to be of highest importance are things like water, ground or surface water, erosion control, flood protection and climate regulation. So then going on from that, we wanted to understand what the risk of disruption is, and this really meant going into more detail to understanding the complex nature of ecosystem services and how those services are provided. So we have a number of fact sheets, one for each ecosystem service, and they really go into detail about how that service is provided to help understand what the potential risk of disruption could be if that ecosystem service or the natural capital that combines to provide it is depleted or changes. So the first part of that is really trying to understand what natural capital assets are involved. And this diagram on the right here just shows how in this project we're looking at natural capital, and this is a classification we've developed to think about natural capital. So if you think of an ecosystem service like mass stabilization and erosion control, which prevents landslides, there might be natural capital assets like habitats, land geomorphology and soils that combine to enable this ecosystem service. So in these fact sheets, we really go down to the level of understanding how they combine to provide that, but then more specifically look at what are the possible drivers of change in those natural capital assets. So thinking about things like deforestation and how those drive change in habitats, for example. But in these fact sheets, we also have a look at prioritizing different aspects. So we look at, well, these are the natural capital assets that provide the service, but which is the most important? Are we able to say that habitats are more important than soils? And then when we look at drivers of change, are we able to say that deforestation, for example, is a more influential driver on habitats than something like pollution? And so that's the level of detail that those fact sheets go into. But in more detail on the drivers of change, which is on the next slide, we look at how those natural capital assets change in response. So thinking about how things like habitats respond to deforestation, like what is the effect? But then looking more in detail about how this will impact on ecosystem service provision. So how will that actually impact the mass stabilization and erosion control as an ecosystem service? And then we also want to understand, is it a result of human action or natural variation, which can help to understand the risk of disruption, whether it's likely to happen in a relatively quick time scale, whether it's likely to fluctuate each year, and also trying to understand the spatial characteristics around that. So does it happen locally or more at a global scale? So then the third aspect was looking at the data. So we really wanted to try and identify what data could be used to assess that disruption risk. So we identified available data sources for both natural capital assets and for different drivers of change at a global and national level for the 4 target countries in the Advancing Environmental Risk Management project. So for the global inventory, we identified around 130 different data sources, and for the national ones, we identified around 30 for each of those countries. But then what we did for both the global and national inventories is we screened each of the data sources that we identified against 18 different criteria to highlight which of those data sources might be robust data for decision making. So thinking about things like the accessibility of the data, the spatial resolution, so thinking about whether the data is available at the country level or more likely or whether it's available on a 1 meter by 1 meter grid cell. And then also looking at things that might be relevant for financial institutions, looking at whether the data source is for the present scenario or whether it also looks at future scenarios to be able to estimate risk in the future. And the graph on the next slide just shows some of the distribution of the data sources that we were able to gather for each of those natural capital assets and drivers of change. And as would probably be expected, we found a lot of data sources for things like habitats, water and species, but less so for things like minerals and geomorphology. And in terms of drivers of change, there's lots for things like weather conditions, so illustrating changes in temperature and precipitation and habitat modification, but less data sources around things like fires and earthquakes and volcanoes. And then just the next slide shows a quick summary of those different criteria. So this is just 3 of the criteria that are within the global data inventory. And this just shows that in terms of data types, the majority of them are secondary data. And secondary data is where the primary data has been taken and it's been processed, or it could alternatively be modeled data, so using climate change models, for example. In terms of update frequency, the majority of the data sources we found were, we don't know how often they're updated, but 50 of the data sources fall into the other categories, so they're updated somewhere between monthly and every 10 years, which is quite promising. And then we also looked at the final one I'm just showing on this slide is around data restrictions, and we found that the majority of the data sources were open access, but there are still around 25% of the data sources in the global inventory that are commercially restricted. So that's something really important to understand for financial institutions possibly using the knowledge base. So then I just wanted to move on. I've just got a few slides on a couple case studies here, just to illustrate how the knowledge base might be used. And the first one I wanted to look at was water. So how water acts as a direct input for businesses. So water is one of the things that most companies are kind of aware of and are considering. And when we look across the production processes in our inventory of business dependencies, we find that around 60% of those production processes depend on water as a direct input. And in this case, we're thinking about surface water like lakes and rivers. And those sort of production processes that depend on water are things that we would expect, like mining and agriculture and manufacturing, and they withdraw a lot of fresh water but also consume it. And there's also a number of other sectors that depend on water as well. So then, as an example, to look at the risk of disruption to water provision, I just wanted to take one example from our ecosystem service fact sheet to really look at how a particular driver can lead to disruption in water provision. So the one that I wanted to use as an example here was habitat modification. So if the habitat is modified in and around an area of surface water, that can lead to disturbance of the natural flow of that water, and it can also lead to sedimentation. And then in terms of the impact on the ecosystem service there, which is water provision, there can be decreased provision of surface water as a result, but also nutrient blooms, which can lead to governments cutting off water to residents and to businesses. So it can have a direct disruption there to business activities. But in order to assess that current and future exposure to risk, there's many data sets that we can look at. So this slide just shows you a few of the data sets that are available within the knowledge base. And then, so it includes things like the aqueduct water risk in that atlas, where you can kind of zoom in to really understand water risk, and that's available at a detailed level at a global scale. So then the second case study is about erosion control. So slightly different in that erosion control tends to be more of an indirect dependency for businesses. So, but actually, when we look across the production processes in this first phase of the project, we find that 70% of production processes depend on erosion control, and that's because most businesses that have a physical base depend on erosion control to protect those businesses, whether that's something like a factory, a retail outlet, or whether it's infrastructure like dams, railways, roads, etc. And here we're thinking about erosion control as the control of things like landslides. So then again, thinking about what the potential risk of disruption to that might be, and I wanted to pick out an example that might not necessarily spring to the forefront of everyone's minds, and just to illustrate the different parts of the natural capital knowledge base. So one of the potential drivers of change is fires, and because fires can damage the vegetation that acts as a kind of a protection for erosion control, so something like forests, and because fires can also remove topsoil, which is acting as a stabilizing force for the environment, it can lead to reduced erosion control, and fires can actually have a huge impact and on erosion control. So as well as being able to, for something like this, needing to understand data on fire, there's also a need to look at data on things like erosion risk. And when we were looking at, for the data sources, this is just on the next slide, we find that there was actually even data sources available to look at erosion risk directly, and that's shown on the right here. That is just a quick example there of erosion risk and water, and I'll just finish up before passing on to Will to think about phase 2. But I hope that this shows a few examples that demonstrate natural capital related risks, but it also, I hope, demonstrates that natural capital related risks are often hidden, and in particular can often be hidden to financial institutions. So the natural capital knowledge base is really a key first step in being able to understand and assess these risks by firstly looking at how businesses depend on different ecosystem services, but then going on to understand more about the potential risks of disruption and what data can be available to look at that disruption risk. But to date, this has really been kind of a scientific pulling together of all of that information, pulling together that knowledge base. And it's a really important next step to be able to test how that integrates within existing risk management processes in financial institutions. So I'll pass on to Will to tell you about that next phase.
Right, thank you very much, Katie, for that overview. I'll just leave it on your very nice picture of a frog while we're introducing Will. Of course, this frog here is one of the species that we're trying to save through this project, so it makes it, I guess, more visible to have it staring in your face.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Katie. I just wanted to remind people that if you have any questions, please do type them into the question box, and we will address them either during the presentations or at the end of the webinar. Now, I think you can appreciate the incredible work that has gone into categorizing and cataloging all of this information from nature and building these kinds of this kind of knowledge that WCMC has done for us. So the very complex and difficult task of linking this to financial institutions then falls in part to our partner in phase 2, which is PwC. And I'll leave it to Will Everson from PwC to explain what is going to happen in that phase. Go ahead, Will.
Thanks very much, Anders. And look, I'd just say at the start, we were so excited to be involved in this project because it is one of those projects that has the real potential to be transformative, to be a real game changer. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, this project is really about allowing financial institutions to understand for the first time how their assets and really how their portfolios depend on natural capital and the actual systems which underpin ecosystem services. And I find it a great example of how we can seek to retain the underlying complexity, a lot of what Katie described in that fantastic body of work, but actually work towards really simple, usable project outputs. And really the art here is in bridging the divide between quality research, ecological data science, and actually ultimately financial decision making, which has to be this has to be one factor in financial decision making, and it has to be distilled into a form that allows frontline bank risk managers to make often quite rapid decisions about the risks facing their investments. So maybe we just flick on one slide, Anders. So what we're doing in phase 2, really first and foremost, is building on that and trying to drive from phase 1. And what we're really looking at initially is how material are those dependencies, and then how can we integrate that information into financial institution risk processes. So we're very much focused in phase 2 on working directly with the partnering financial institutions in Colombia, Peru, and South Africa to pilot test implementation of this knowledge base. There's then the objective to share publicly the outputs of all of this work. And of course, the ultimate goal is really progressing environmental risk management in financial institutions towards taking into account ecological systems to the greatest extent possible. If we can move on, and there's one more. So these are some of the key participants. You see the 5 banks at the bottom of this slide. Of course, the participating institutions at the top. I'll mention Little Blue Research, which is Steph Himes' consultancy, which is a great little organization who we're also working with on this. And I made a complete error and didn't include UNEP-WCMC, but Katie would be kicking me for that, because I certainly should have. UNEP-WCMC are closely involved with us in this stage of work as well, and providing really helpful ecological guidance for all of this work. Thanks, Anders. So I'm going to cover these 3 slides very quickly, because Katie did a much better job than I could of describing how all of this works. But this is just another example pulled from the Natural Capital Protocol. So, and I'm just going to use it to explain a couple of the things we're doing in this stage of the work right at the start. So business activities, as we know, depend on these goods and services provided by natural capital, or ecosystem services as shorthand. So a coffee processing plant has this indirect dependency on pollination services, and really we'd say that the coffee farmer themselves has a direct dependency on those pollination services. But it's certainly not far removed from the coffee processing plant. Next. Now, if we have those kinds of changes in natural capital that Katie was describing some of, we could, one of the outcomes of that could be reduction in natural pollination services. Now, for the coffee farmer, that would likely be a fairly significant issue. Most types of coffee are fairly heavily pollinated by insects. And next one, please. Anders. Now, here's where we really link into this phase of work. So in the example from the protocol, well, in this case of pollination services, the farmer may be able to pay for commercial pollination services. So he may be able to import some hives of bees, or pursue one of the other more sort of creative and technical methods of pollination that are emerging. And this really highlights one of the things we're getting at in this stage of work about how does the change in ecosystem services affect the production process, and how does that change in the production process affect the financial prospects of the organization affected. So this is really, in a microcosm, one example of the relationships that we're looking at between hundreds of production processes and many different types of ecosystem service. Next, please. So to understand the financial risk exposure, first we need to think about the sensitivity of the production process to this change in ecosystem services. So in this case, if it's pollination is a neat example. For coffee, it's partly wind pollinated, partly insect pollinated. wind-pollinated. So yields would certainly be reduced through a reduction here. If we were talking about certain crops like wheat and corn, there would be no immediate impact on the yields because they're wind-pollinated. So just an example of how the sensitivity to a change can be very different. And the next. And then we also need to understand, well, what's the potential financial impact of that disruption to the production process? So actually, are there easy alternatives to the ecosystem service that could be used? Not necessarily that we would advocate these sort of alternative technical solutions. That the initial desire would be to sustain the original ecological services, and that is really part of the purpose behind this work. But if there are practical alternatives, then for a financial institution, the short-term effects will be mediated that way. So in this example, there's an alternative, probably a highly and possibly prohibitively expensive alternative for most coffee farmers. Next slide, please. And if you do one more click as well. So really, the very first part of our phase 2 is just building on that brilliant knowledge base that Katie and her team and the NCFA group established in phase 1, and really adding, if we add answers to these 2 questions, what we get to is the materiality of those ecosystem service dependencies to those production processes, and we can group production processes up to the level of sectors and understand what's the materiality of these ecosystem services to different sectors of the economy. So step 1 is doing that, and it's painstaking work, but we had a great workshop working through a lot of the challenges in that yesterday, so feeling very positive about it. Next one, please, Anders. So then the project is built from that initial foundation. So the first, that previous step is the blue one here, just building on the knowledge base. Then with those participating financial institutions, we're going to work at a country level to do initial dependency risk materiality assessments. So using the knowledge base, tailoring it, using the data sources identified by WCMC, and others, and looking at the materiality for key sectors in the participating banks' portfolio. And the next step is then a slightly deeper dive quantitative assessments, perhaps looking at individual sectors, possibly even significant individual assets, looking at how could dependency risk translate into value at risk or some equivalent measure of risk for particular assets or sectors for those financial institutions. So that will be a bit sort of closer to the ground and looking really at much more local factors and local drivers of change. And then ultimately, towards the end of this year, bringing all of this together and preparing the key project outputs, which we will, of course, deliver on time. And my final slide is just a recap of those points I made at the start. So it's really about testing the knowledge base with financial institutions, disseminating the tools and the learnings that we create through that process, and really trying to progress environmental risk management towards that understanding of systems and dependencies to really enhance it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Will, for that overview, and good to hear that you'll be delivering on time. So as mentioned, if you have any questions, please do type them into the question box, and we will address them during the course of the webinar. Just maybe to do a little bit of a recap of how everything fits in here, because I do appreciate that there's a lot of different I guess elements to this whole project. So we have developed a with WCMC a knowledge base for natural capital risk, which is searchable and has fact sheets, and you can explore all of the dependencies and look at the relationships between nature and the economy by sector, and then ultimately you can link that to different types of applications, be it corporate, financial, policy making, or other aspects. But in our case, we focus on financial institutions. So building on that, we have an application on environmental risk management for financial institutions, which is specifically, in this phase at least, tailored for banks. And what we will deliver as part of this is a tested approach, methodology for financial institutions to assess natural capital risk in their portfolio using this knowledge base. So the process of working with financial institutions in Colombia, in Peru, and in South Africa is for us to develop a generic methodology that can be used by all banks globally. That is really the aim of this part of the project. So that at the end of the project, towards the end of the year, we will have this methodology. It's being tested in 5 banks. We'll have 5 case studies that show quite a detailed application of the feasibility of quantifying natural capital risks. So really going beyond just highlighting risk in portfolio, but also seeing if we can quantify it and where in the current risk management process banks would want to address these risks. Is it in origination? Is it in credit risk? Is it in reporting? So one can address these issues in the most appropriate way, depending on the current risk process. I mean, one of the experiences we have had with developing these types of natural capital risk management tools over the last couple of years is that, especially in banks, there's a big difference in how risk management is done. So we feel that providing a methodology and a framework in this case would be more appropriate than say an Excel sheet or a generic tool that one would expect to be slotted in a specific place. So it's really about the ability for banks to take this, tailor it to their own institutions, and gain a good understanding of how they are exposed to or potentially exposed to natural capital risks, which types of risks, in what regions, in what sectors, and what drivers they're exposed to. And as mentioned, our ambition for the next couple of years is to then move this onto a tool for investors, which I expect would be, we will be able to probably make a more generic tool. So we're developing a number of specific outputs for the end of the year. We will have a user interface developed, which is a sort of online interface. You can go to a website and explore the knowledge base through which risk drivers you can see, look at some regional effects, and really see what WCMC has collected in a very neat and accessible user interface, so you can start developing your analysis. And then we will have this application into financial institutions, which will be possible to adopt by any financial institution, any bank globally. So I have a couple of questions that have come in. So I'll address some of these right now. If you do have any others, please do continue to send them in. So one of the questions is it compulsory for a financial institution to pilot the knowledge base with PwC? Or can the financial institution just access the knowledge base on its own? Now, the reason why we work with PwC on these pilots is because they have very good risk management expertise and fantastic experience of working on risk issues with financial institutions. And they've made available teams in, not just this global team that Will heads, but also teams in our priority countries that work directly with these piloting financial institutions. But the ambition with doing these pilots is to use that to create a generic tool, methodology, or framework for natural capital risk. So it'll provide a detailed step-by-step analysis or a process that financial institutions can take. So at the end of November, when we launch this, you'll be able to essentially download a process that you can use yourself to assess natural capital risk in your portfolio. Now, some financial institutions may want to work with consultancies to assist in this. PwC could be one of those consultancies, but also other consultancies should be able to provide some service around this. So it's not compulsory to work with PwC once this project has been completed. Given that we have just hit the top of the hour, I'm going to then quickly just re-emphasize the timeline. So right now we are in a process of working with PwC to do this pilot testing with the partnering financial institutions. We're just about to start the user interface development, and both of these processes in phase 2 will go in parallel. And then towards Q4, we will be reviewing and synthesizing this output so that it's ready for launch at the UNEP Finance Initiative Global Roundtable in Paris on the 26th of November. Finally, I do have a offer for financial institutions if you want to be part of this still. I mentioned the user interface. As part of the user interface development, we want to talk with people, risk managers, sustainability analysts, portfolio analysts working in financial institutions that might be interested in helping us develop an appropriate user interface for this tool so that it's something that you can adopt easily in your day-to-day work when you look at environmental risks. So if you're interested in being part of this, if you are working in a financial institution on this, please do contact Martin Halle on the email there, or look for our contact information on our website. And with that, since it is the top of the hour, 2 minutes past the hour, I think we are going to close it there. If you do have any additional questions that you come up with, please do contact us, contact Lisa Petrovich there. You have her emails, or look at our website for contact information. I do want to send my tremendous thank to Giorgio Capuri from UniCredit for his input, Katie Leach from UNEP-WCMC for her input, and of course Will Evison from PwC for your overview of phase 2. We are incredibly excited about this project. You should also be very excited about this project. And we aim to do a couple of more of these update webinars before the official launch at the end of November. So do please keep lookout for that. And I wish you all a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you are. And thank you very much for attending.